Hi, I'm Susan Rutledge, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to use the perspective grid in Adobe Illustrator. This is something you may have shied away from in the past because it's not super intuitive, but I promise if you'll stick with me to the end of the tutorial, you'll have the information you need to use this grid in your project. Now in this video, I'm going to be showing you how the grid works, how you can actually draw an object in perspective on the grid, how you can take something that was previously created to be a one-dimensional object and drag it into perspective on the grid. I'll show you how to take text and place it on the grid so it's in perspective. Let's move that up on top of that layer. And then last but not least, I'm going to show you how to take photographs and put them in perspective. So if you like what you see and you're learning some things, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my future tutorials. When you're working with the perspective grid, you're going to be toggling back and forth between two separate tools, so it's important to memorize their keyboard shortcuts. Right now, the perspective grid tool is active. Its keyboard shortcut is Shift-P. This is the tool that turns on the grid. It's the tool that displays all of the handles and allows you to move the grid pieces around. The other tool is the perspective selection tool, and its keyboard shortcut is Shift-V. This is the tool you use when you want to bring in one-dimensional objects and text into your perspective grid. Now, even for people who have never worked with the perspective grid in Illustrator, one of the most asked questions is how to turn the grid off. Even I've been there, and the easiest way is to come up to this little widget here and click on this little tiny white X. You can see the text next to that that says Hide Grid. But the way I'd like you to learn how to turn it off is with the keyboard shortcut Shift-Command-I. And just think of invisible starts with I, because this is the way you can toggle your grid on and off. And when you're working with the grid, you're going to want to be able to do that so you can get a more clear look at your work. And then if you forget all of those, you can always go up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and click on Hide Grid here. This grid is what Illustrator calls a two-point perspective grid. I'll get the perspective grid tool, keyboard shortcut Shift-P, so I can show you why. It's because it has two vanishing points, one on the left and one on the right. And this green line that runs in between them represents the horizon. Now I can move either of these vanishing points to the right or to the left. Notice they're rotating from this spot right here, which is called the station point. But if you only want one of the vanishing points to change, you can go up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and unlock the station point. And then when I move one of the vanishing points, the other one remains in the same position. But I don't want to do that, so I'll undo the move, keyboard shortcut Command-Z. This top diamond allows you to lower or raise the grid, and the bottom diamond allows you to change the number of the squares that are on the grid. And these two side diamonds on the right and on the left of the grid determine how far the grid is going to extend towards the vanishing points. Then this bottom circle moves the base of the grid up or down. Then these three circles down here move the planes themselves. The left circle moves the right plane. The right circle moves the left plane, and the bottom circle moves the bottom horizontal plane. On the outside of the grid, at the horizon level on the left and on the right, I have these little diamonds that allow me to move the horizon, which changes the perspective. And then along the ground line on the outside, I have diamonds which allow me to move the entire grid, and I can move it wherever I want on the artboard. Just know that the grid is the only thing that's going to move, and if you had any artwork, it's going to stay exactly where it was. Now I want to get back to where I was when I started. So I'm going to go back up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and come down to 2-point perspective and click on 2P Normal View. And once again, we're back to the default setting. Now sometimes when you're working with the perspective grid, all these lines from the different planes can be a bit distracting, but the good news is there's a way to control that, and that's with these 3 little circles down here. Now this left circle is the one that we used to change the right plane. So if I hold down the Option key and click, it's going to change the right plane to a solid color, and then clicking again makes it invisible. And finally, the third time I click, it brings it back to the default setting. The right circle is going to change the left plane, and the bottom circle is going to change the bottom horizontal plane. Now, if you create a perspective grid that you want to use over and over again, you can actually save that as a preset. To do that, you'd go up to Edit, down to Perspective Grid Presets, and click here. Now we have the 3 perspective grid presets that come with Illustrator, but to add another one, I'll click on the plus sign, and this opens up the perspective grid preset options dialog box. The first thing you want to do is give your grid a name. I'm just going to put Susan here and make sure all of the settings are the way I want them to be, and then I'll click OK. Now the Susan grid has been added to my presets, and I'll be able to use it again. I could even edit it if I wanted to, export it if I want, and this is also where I'd come to import a preset. I'm just going to say OK, and we'll close out of that. Now let me show you how you choose what side or what plane you're going to draw on the perspective grid. And we do that by using the perspective grid widget, which is in the top left corner of your workspace. Right now, blue is showing, which matches up with the blue vertical plane, so that's the one I can draw on. I can come over and grab one of the tools, like the rectangle tool. The keyboard shortcut for that is M. You can see I have an arrow pointing to the left with my cursor, which indicates I'm going to be drawing on the left side of the grid. So I'll just start up here at the top and drag out. And that's placed in perspective of the blue plane. Now I'll come over to the orange plane and drag out a rectangle here, but because I still have the blue plane selected, Illustrator is placing it in the perspective of the blue plane. So I'm going to undo that move, keyboard shortcut Command Z. Go back to the widget and click on the top right part of the cube. Now orange is showing. I have an arrow pointing right, which means I'm going to be drawing on the right side. And now when I drag out a rectangle, it's placed in the perspective of the orange vertical plane. The same principle applies for the horizontal plane. I'll go back to the cube and click on the bottom section of it. Green is now showing, and when I draw out a rectangle, it's placed on the horizontal plane. Well, what if I want to create an object that has a lot of detail? I might want to make that without any perspective and then just drag it in. So you might think I could just get anywhere outside the grid and drag out a rectangle, but in fact I can't. Anytime one of the planes is selected, Illustrator is going to draw any object that I create in that plane. So I'll undo that move, keyboard shortcut Command Z, and come back to the widget, and I've got to click on the gray area that's around the cube without clicking on the cube, and you can see the text says no active grid. So I'll press down here. When this turns light blue, it means I can drag out a one-dimensional object and add whatever detail I want. Now there is a faster way to switch between the different planes on the grid, and if you've watched my other videos, you might guess it is keyboard shortcuts. So look up here at the little widget. Right now the blue side is showing, but I'm going to press number 2 on my keyboard. that moves to the green horizontal plane, and then pressing 3 takes me to the orange vertical plane and back to 1 for that first blue vertical plane. And when you're drawing back and forth, this can be super helpful, which I'm going to show you in just a second. But before I start drawing, there are a couple of settings I want to call your attention to. The first one is Smart Guides, and you turn those on by going up to View and down to Smart Guides here, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Command U. Then we need to make sure Snap to Grid is turned off and Snap to Grid is turned on. What do I mean by that? Well, let me get the selection tool, keyboard shortcut V. When I click on the artboard to deselect everything, I have snap options available in the properties panel. And I want to make sure that Snap to Grid is turned off. If it's highlighted, it's on, just click to turn it off. The reason is this Snap to Grid snaps to this grid, which is on the artboard. And when you're snapping to this grid, you're going to run into problems if you wanted to snap to one of these intersections. So I'll turn the grid off, and I'm going to make sure Snap to Grid is turned off. However, I do want to be able to snap to this grid. To do that, I go up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and you can turn Snap to Grid on right here. Now I'm going to get rid of these objects, which I drew earlier. For this one, I'm going to select it and change its color. Then I'll click on the artboard to close the swatches panel, get the perspective selection tool, keyboard shortcut Shift V. I'll drag the top down, and notice we can see Smart Guides telling me I'm right on the path, and I'll release my mouse. This is going to be the side of my building. I could press the number 2 to activate the orange side and draw the front here. Or if I want the front to be exactly the same size as this side, I could simply grab the purple piece and drag it over to the orange side so that it's exactly the same size. So what I'm going to do is grab hold of it and just drag to the right. As I'm dragging, I'm going to press the number 3 because I want to convert it to the orange perspective. And then I'll keep dragging until I see it snap into place. But before I release my mouse, I'm going to hold down the Option key, which is allowing me to make a copy instead of actually moving that piece away from the left side. When I'm holding down the Option key, I'll release my mouse, and now I have the exact same size on both the front and on the side. Now I'm going to change the front color to a lighter purple because I'm imagining the sun is shining down on this side. I'll click on the artboard to close out the swatches panel, and now I'm going to add a decorative cornice to the top of my building. I'll get the rectangle tool, keyboard shortcut M. I have the orange plane selected, and I'm just going to start dragging from the top left corner of every other one of these squares. And I'm making sure to start all the way up at the top and try to get lined up on the two sides. I'm dragging down a little below that line that's at the bottom, and we'll straighten all that up in just a few minutes. But the further back I get, the tinier these squares are, and they are kind of hard to see and get right, so I got to take a little extra time. And I'm going to move over to the properties panel and change the color on my tool. Click to close out the swatches panel, and then I'll press 1 to change to the blue perspective, but I'm going to draw on the orange side. So I'll just drag across here, and again, I'm not concerned about going across this bottom line because I'll take care of that in a minute. And I'll just quickly go through here. You can see that we're now providing a little shadow. And there's all sorts of ways that you can use color with the perspective grid to give depth to your drawing. It really makes it come alive. Now that's looking pretty good, but I'm going to get the selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, select the big part here, and move it to the front. I can either go up to Object, Arrange, and click here, or I can use the keyboard shortcut Shift Command right bracket. Now I have a nice line right across here. I'm going to go do the other side now, and then I'll be right back. Well, that was pretty easy. Now I'm going to toggle the grid off so you can see our work. Keyboard shortcut Shift Command I. You can see without the grid how nice that really looks. I'll turn the grid back on. Keyboard shortcut Shift Command I. Now I'm going to come over to the Layers panel and reveal a few objects we had at the beginning of the video and show you what to do with those. Now when you're working with text to place it in perspective, you can't type directly on the perspective grid. You've got to set your text up first and then drag it in. Now be sure before you drag the text in, you've got the right color, and if you want a stroke, you add it in advance, because you won't be able to do that once you move the text onto the grid unless you expand its appearance. Well, I've got the text pet store here. To move it onto the grid, I've got to use the perspective selection tool. Again, that is keyboard shortcut Shift V. And I want to move it to the orange grid. So I'll press the number 3. We can see orange is highlighted on my little widget, and all I've got to do is grab hold of the text and drag it into position. I can resize it if I want. Now, because I created the text before I created the front of the building, the text is on a layer behind the building. To move it to the front, I could either come up to Object, down to Arrange, and click on Bring to Front, or I can use that keyboard shortcut, Shift Command right bracket. And now my text is on the orange grid in perspective. Let's toggle the grid off so we can get a better look. Keyboard shortcut Shift Command I. And that's looking pretty good. I'll toggle the grid back on, keyboard shortcut Shift Command I. And now, because I didn't explain the steps at the beginning of the video, I'm going to show you how you move a one-dimensional object onto the grid. So I have this one-dimensional design which I've created. I'm using the perspective selection tool. We can see it highlighted on the left toolbar. I want to drag this design onto the blue plane, and so I'll press the number 1 and simply drag it onto the grid. Now once I have it there, I'll hold the Shift key down, and I'm going to just drag a little ways here, kind of center this. And again, the object was created before the side of the building, so I'm going to have to move the design to the front. I'll use the keyboard shortcut Shift Command right bracket. Click on the artboard to deselect it and toggle the grid off, keyboard shortcut Shift Command I, and that's all you have to do. Now, just like when you're working with text that you've imported onto the grid, when you bring in a design that you've created, you can't change the color of that either, nor can you add a stroke. So make sure you have it just like you want it. If I decided I wanted to either change the color or add a stroke to this, I'd simply undo the last few moves to get the object back on the artboard, add a stroke, and then bring it back in. But I'm going to leave it the way it is right now. In fact, I'm going to get the selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, and I'm going to delete everything off of the artboard. Now, I'll use this little guy in a minute. In fact, I'm going to use this other picture as well. But I first want to take a quick look at the other 2 preset perspective grids that Illustrator comes with. So I'm going to come up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and click on 1P Normal View. Now we have the 1-point grid. It's 1 point because it has 1 vanishing point. I have the grid, but in order to do anything with it, I've got to activate one of the tools. So I'll get the Perspective Grid tool, keyboard shortcut Shift P. And you can see how similar the different handles are to the 2-point perspective grid. I can move the blue grid to the left using this little circle here. This circle is going to move the bottom horizontal grid. We use the number 1 for the blue grid. We'll use the number 2 to change to the horizontal grid. 3 isn't going to do anything because there's not an orange grid, but the 4 does work so that we can draw something on the artboard without it going into perspective. Now, what are some of the uses for the 1-point perspective grid? Well, you could draw a highway or a railroad, for instance, because we have one horizontal point that's going off into the distance. Now, to change to the 3-point perspective grid, I'll go back up to View, down to Perspective Grid, over and down to the 3-point perspective grid, and click on 3P Normal View. And this grid is hanging off of the bottom of my artboard. So I'm going to grab hold of the little diamond here and move it up so we can get a little bit more of an idea where our vanishing points are. Let's hide these little guys here. So I have one on the right, one on the left, and one way down here at the bottom. Now, this is a great grid to use if you're creating a scene where you're looking at buildings from the top down. And in this case, because we have 3 planes, we're also going to be able to use all of those widget numbers we used with the 2-point perspective grid. This is 4, here's 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to go back to that 2-point perspective grid. I'll come up to View, down to Perspective Grid, and come back here and choose the 2P Normal View. And we're going to do one more thing. I'm going to show you how to put photographs on your perspective grid. So let me reveal these guys again. Then I want to change the number of squares on my grid. So I'll get the Perspective Grid tool, keyboard shortcut Shift P, and drag this little diamond up a ways, then move to the Properties panel, and I'm going to change my active color, and then get the Rectangle tool, keyboard shortcut M. Then I'm going to drag one rectangle out on the blue plane, and get the Perspective Selection tool, keyboard shortcut Shift V, because I want to create the same size rectangle on the right side. So I'm going to begin to drag the rectangle and then press the number 3 so it switches to the orange grid. When I have the rectangle in place, I'll press the Option key down and release my mouse. Now I get the Selection tool, keyboard shortcut V. I'm going to select the dog on the left, and I've got to come over to the Properties panel and embed the photograph. And I'll go ahead and do this picture as well. I'm not using a perspective grid tool, I just have the selection tool active. I'll drag him down until he's touching the rectangle on the orange grid, and it's important that the picture is actually behind that rectangle layer. If it's in front of the layer, you'll need to use the keyboard shortcut Shift Command left bracket to move it behind the rectangle. Then I'll hold the Shift key down so I can select both the rectangle and the picture. Come up to Object, down to Envelope Distort, over and down to Make with Top Object. It's just going to take a couple of seconds, and my picture is placed in perspective on the orange grid. And I'll do the same thing with the other picture. I'll grab hold of it, drag it down to where it's touching the rectangle on the blue plane, and the picture is behind the rectangle. I'll hold the Shift key down to select the rectangle, go back up to Object, down to Envelope Distort, and click on Make with Top Object again. Now I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Shift Command I to turn off the grid and click on the artboard to deselect that last picture. And that is how you put photographs in perspective on the perspective grid in Adobe Illustrator. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it's taken away some of the mystery surrounding the perspective grid. Once you know the basics of how it works, it's not quite so intimidating, and I believe you're going to be able to use it in some of your projects. Now, before you go, if you haven't already, be sure and subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss any of my future tutorials, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye now.